Welcome to the Expanding Worlds podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Caldo. Over this series on housing options, we've heard quite a lot from parents who've developed their own solutions. But of course, this is not possible for everyone. For most of us, we will need to work with housing providers and charities to help us find the right housing options for our young people. And these organisations will need to find the right property in the right location. And bringing all these different stakeholders together is exactly what this week's guest, Lisa Brown, is aiming to do. Lisa's background is in nursing and she now works in property, but her real passion is bringing together organisations supporting people who need supported housing and property owners in a way that puts people before profit. Lisa and I do discuss some of the controversial issues that surround supported living in the UK, with the wrong people getting involved for the wrong reasons. But she also explains why there is reason for optimism, and why with changes in perceptions from all sides, then we could get to that point where supported housing providers will have more choice in not only the properties that are available, but in who they choose to work with. And if you want to find out more about the work that Lisa's doing and the community that she's building, then you can visit her website, lisabrown.uk, and the links to her website and her Facebook community are in the show notes. But enough from me, let's hear from Lisa. Can I start off by asking you to talk a little bit about your background and also what you're trying to change in terms of supported living in the UK?
Of course. Thanks, Deborah. It's great to be here today. Thank you for inviting me on. So my background is as a nurse. I was an emergency nurse for a long time. I worked my way up to sort of senior sister roles, and then I did a bit of community nursing. And then we moved to Devon and I struggled to get part-time senior nursing work around my children. And I got a bit frustrated with people telling me I should be going back to being a staff nurse. And so I started exploring other ways that I could make some money. And I thought, I've always been really interested in property. Why don't I try and get my head around this property business a bit? And as I was driving the kids around, I basically listened to loads of podcasts and learned loads about property. I developed a couple of heritage flats, really loved that process and thought this is going to be me for life doing these beautiful heritage properties. This is perfect. And then I was randomly approached by a specialist housing association who said, looks like you're a landlord in Devon. Would you consider buying a property for a young man with learning disabilities? And I was like, sounds really interesting. What's this about? Why don't, picked up the phone to them, had a chat. And they'd basically had a landlord pull out of purchasing this property for this young man who was in desperate need of a home and was about to be admitted to hospital. And, it intrigued me, if nothing else. I was like, well, of course, it makes perfect sense. If I can do that with, this pot of money that I've got from the last house that I've just refurbed, brilliant, let me do that. And in the process of doing that bungalow up for this young man, I went on a really steep learning curve. The actual process of developing the property was really quite straightforward as any property development is, refurb is. But I basically, was using my kind of like common sense nurse brain with a bit of property brain, with a bit of common sense mom brain in there, of just trying to work out how to make this property meet this young man's needs. And he had quite complex requirements and there was a lot of stuff that we needed to adapt to make sure the property was safe for him. But I found it really natural liaising with his parents, liaising with the care team and getting all that sorted. So we really made this property the best we could for him. He moved into the property and he settled really quickly. And all the good things we know about getting someone in their right home, he moved, his support needs dropped from 4 to 1 24 hours a day to 2 to 1 24 hours a day because he was settled and he felt safe and all the things we know that matter about getting someone in the right place. But sadly, I then discovered that it was a nightmare to try and refinance this property. I couldn't get a mortgage. I found a mortgage company who would agree to give me a mortgage on this property, but they sent a surveyor out. The surveyor came around and said, oh my goodness, you've ruined that property, Lisa. You've absolutely ruined it. They knocked the value down dramatically. I ended up leaving so much more money in that deal than I'd planned to as a property investor. Then I struggled to get insurance too. And so I went on this really I got very frustrated by it, to be honest, because at the same time I was getting other care providers locally going, Lisa, that's brilliant. I love what you've done there. Can you do me 2 of those? We need 3 of those. And I was like, there must be people doing this. There has to be a way to make this work, because I could see it was a really good way to invest in property without these stumbling blocks of the mortgage and the insurance. But I could see that actually it's what was needed. And so I went on a bit of a mission to discover and find other people who were doing supported living as private property investors. And actually at that point, I really struggled to find anybody else. I was just like, there must be. I was searching property forums, putting in supported living, putting in learning disabilities, really struggled to find anyone. And I could see that the big funds, the big pension funds and the real estate investment trusts were throwing millions of pounds at this space. So they could obviously see it was a really good investment model. But private property investors that I could find weren't really involved in it. Sort of decided to put a stake in the ground, set up a Facebook group and just kind of try and invite anyone who might be interested in this as a way of investing in property, to try and learn from other people, to try and connect with other people and try and build this community and say, who else is doing this? There must be other people out there who are doing it. And I found lots of people who are really interested in this, and that's the thing. I think there's lots of property investors who like the idea of doing something different with their money they've got to invest or with the properties that they own already. And I think, you and I were saying this before we started, Deborah, but, I think there's a lot of negative press around landlords and property investors. But actually, as property investors, we play a really important role in society. We meet a need that a lot of, that isn't being met by social housing currently. There is not enough rental properties in the UK for anybody. There's a massive shortage of supply. So private property investors buying properties, doing them up well, looking after their tenants and doing things ethically. Actually, it's a good, there's a lot of good people around there doing this. And then they're really interested in the idea that actually they could let their property to people with support needs, whatever that support need happens to be. That doesn't scare people so much. People are really interested in it and they want to learn about it and they want to understand it. So that's kind of what I've been doing, really, in a very long story of an explanation, Deborah.
Do you think that people come into it initially because I think you just talked about the negativity, and I think sometimes people think that property investors are coming in it just for the money. Are you finding that more people are thinking, well, actually, I want to give back, and there's an underlying ethical reason for wanting to be involved? But are there still people that have the opposite of that? Are you finding both sides of that?
Yeah, I think both. I think it appeals to two sets of property investors. It appeals to tired property investors who are fed up of managing tenants. Because if you set up supported living property correctly, you have a housing association who acts as the landlord. So you're a step removed from the tenant management, which appeals to a lot of, property investors who are fed up of managing tenants. And I think sometimes the numbers can work well. So I think sometimes that does appeal to people as a good investment model, purely looking at the numbers. But I think there's a huge number of property investors who actually want to look at this space because they want to do something to make a difference. I think even since COVID, we've seen an increase in that. I think people have become maybe a little bit more socially aware, perhaps just a little bit more switched on to their purpose and what they're looking to do. I feel like that's something where there has been a change as well. But I think people really like the idea of making a difference. And actually, I have conversations with people where they say to me, I'd love to do that, but I just need to get myself a bit more financially stable and then I'll be able to do it. Because actually what they see it as is almost like a charitable act once they've built their portfolio. So when I say actually you can do it to make it cash flow for you in the same way that a normal property would, and you can still make a difference, then people are like, oh, brilliant, let's go for that then. It does make sense for people. So I think much as people would like to assume that all landlords are evil and bad, and sadly there are still some around, I think the majority of them actually are good people looking to help and support people. Sadly, like I said, there are bad landlords around and we've all had experience of them, whether as tenants or people we know. And that is the case. But I think when you look at the majority of property investors, they're actually good people trying to do good things.
Just to some of the sort of things you talked about before about the challenges in people who wanted to provide properties around things like mortgages and insurance. What's happening with that? Why do you think that's the case? And also what needs to change?
I think some of it comes down to a lack of understanding of the underwriters and the mortgage companies. So I think some of it comes down to a level of fear that they see it as higher risk in some way, when actually I feel like it isn't. If you've done your due diligence on the organisation letting your property, and I think actually it isn't a high risk strategy because you're looking at long-term tenants. If you get a property right for somebody with support needs, the chances are they're going to stay in that property. So actually it's a good, secure investment. So there's the lack of understanding. I think if I'm being harsh, I could say, is there an element of discrimination in there? I think they talk about tenants being vulnerable and they say that they don't, most mortgage products won't allow you to let properties to tenants who are classed as vulnerable tenants, which are tenants with support needs. They talk about this being reputational risk, because if I was to default payments on a mortgage, then they would have to repossess the property. They would have to evict the tenants and sell the property very quickly to try and recoup their funds. And so they say it's reputational risk if they have to kick, say, the young man in my bungalow out onto the street. I personally think it doesn't look great on the front page of the local paper, but nor does kicking out a single mum with 3 children look great on the front page of the local paper. And they're very happy for me to let another property of mine on a standard buy-to-let mortgage to a single mum with 3 children. they don't quibble that at all. So is there an element of discrimination in there? I don't know. So I think it's also the fact that it's a relatively new concept for a lot of mortgage companies. So it feels like it's a new space. They don't quite understand it in the way that maybe holiday let mortgages were relatively new a few years ago. And now we're seeing those balloon and increase. So it's something that I'm actively campaigning on. If you follow me on social media, I bang on about it and try and raise awareness of this as an issue, because I think it's really important. And I think it's one of the stumbling blocks to the supply of property for people who need them. It's something I'm working on, and I'm working with beginning to have conversations with some people high up in some banks and some organisations. And I think we'll begin to see some change here, which I'm really excited about, because that was one of my big ambitions, was if we can just do something to change this a little bit, it will open it up for everybody to be able to get into this space more easily, which will solve the problem of the amount of properties that are needed. We'll go a bit of a way to doing that. So hopefully we'll get there. But, it's just trying to make people aware within the lending institutions that this is an issue and there is a need. And actually, I think if you're a mortgage company or you're a bank, it's a really good model to get into, because there isn't good products out there to do this. We need products available. So I think it would make good business sense for them to be getting into.
You talked there a little bit about the sense of people being vulnerable and there's a risk associated. What are some of the things that potential landlords say to you about the concerns that they have, that maybe as potentially for someone like me as a parent could sort of say, well, actually, this isn't going to happen? Because you're right. I mean, I think that's a real issue generally across additional needs, is this othering of people, of, not trying to even understand that they're not different. They just might have different requirements, but they're not different in that same way. So what are some of the things that landlords say to you that you sort of go, actually, that's rubbish? Or
I think a lot of the fear amongst landlords is that if something went wrong with the provider in the property, they would somehow be responsible. And I think, a lot of very good people are worried about that. They feel like, oh my goodness, I wouldn't know how to support someone. I wouldn't be able to go in and do the support. I wouldn't know how to do that. And that's a genuine fear of people. So I think helping them understand how it's structured and how, actually as the landlord, you are a step removed. You may well never meet the tenants, because it's probably not appropriate for you to meet them actually ever in the property, actually depending on the people who are living in the property and the way that it's structured, and that actually you're really quite removed from that. And so therefore that reassures people. But I think that's the common concern, is what happens if things go wrong. So I think that's something parents can definitely help. And I think helping property investors understand that actually this is a long-term commitment on their side, that if they're committing to creating a home for somebody, that this is actually your intention is this person may well stay there for the rest of their life if you get this property right. So are you prepared for that? How will you handle that? How will you manage that? But also helping them to realise that on the flip side, as a property investor, that's what most of property investors want, is long-term tenants, because you're not having to re-advertise your property. You've not got your property empty for a few months between tenants. Actually, that's a really good thing, but also sometimes can be a little bit concerning, that responsibility, making sure people understand that they're entering into a commitment to somebody, really.
And I think that would be a concern for someone if they're putting their young person into a rental property, is security of tenure, because one of the things that's important is creating a community around that person, whoever they are, whether they have additional needs or not. That's community is really important, isn't it? So that would be an issue. When it comes to your the supported living providers, the sort of organisations that are almost that sort of gatekeeper, what are some of the issues that they have when I'm sure you're talking to them as well, what are some of the issues they have when it comes to dealing with, say, private landlords?
They find it difficult convincing private landlords sometimes that this is a good thing to do. So I think sometimes maybe they don't speak the same language as property investors. And I feel like we've got these two camps that don't quite speak to each other very well, because they work in their own siloed way. I spend a lot of time trying to help them to understand how to speak to the other side. And that's a lot of what I seem to do, is just go, actually, if you said it like this, you'd help the property investors understand what a good deal this is, how this would work for them, and help them with those fears and overcoming those concerns. So I think supply of property is a big problem for a lot of providers, partly because of that fear, partly because of the mortgage issues and the insurance issues. They can add costs in, so they make it a bit more difficult sometimes as well for property investors. I think supply of property and convincing landlords to work with them sometimes is difficult. And I think you've got a whole range of organisations, haven't you? I'm sure the parents listening will all be familiar with. There's such a huge variety of size and shape and number of support organisations. Some of them are tiny little local organisations who maybe support a few individuals. Some of them are huge national care companies that support thousands of people across the country. So each of those will work in a different way, and they'll have to have a different message and a different way that they work with the property investors. So I think that can be a real challenge as well.
I'm guessing parents can help break down some of those barriers in communication as well if they're talking to their care provider and saying, this is an option for my young person to go and live in this area because potentially there might be an investor there who can provide properties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as parents, I speak to a lot of parents, and I think actually they've got a really powerful role in helping sort of bridge that connection sometimes, or actually bringing in a property, because they may know property investors, or they may be able to find property investors in their area and introduce them to the providers and say, actually, this property investor is really happy to provide a property for John, and let's work together and do that. And that makes that life easier for the providers if there's a property investor who is already warmed up and is open to the idea, and understands what's happening. So I think as an active parent, you can actually do. I know there's so much that you guys do all the time, but there is stuff that you can do there in that space to help sometimes make that a bit easier for everybody.
So I guess to just finish up then, where next? What kind of things need to change?
So I think the finance and the insurance are my frustration constantly for property investors. And that's something that I really think we need to change. And I think change is coming. Hopefully it's slower, so much slower than I'd anticipated. But, I feel like we're crawling through treacle and we'll get there with it. So, we will get there with that change. And that will make a massive difference to the supply of property. I think educating everybody so everybody understands it. And that's on both sides. And I feel like there's better conversations that needs to be had between property investors and the providers, and helping people to come together to understand each other better is something that I'm passionate about, and that's where I'm kind of focusing at the moment.
There's still that sort of, I guess, conflict, isn't it, about what both parties are in it for, and not really understanding, as you said, that there's a lot of ethical property investors out there who just want to give something back, but also clearly want to, have a property and make money, because that's why you get into property, but also give something back. And then there's the providers who don't understand that there's landlords like that out there, because perhaps they've dealt with landlords who haven't been like that in the past. And as parents, we kind of get caught in the middle a little bit, wanting the best for our kids. But I think what's important, and what you're trying to do, I gather, is get everybody to understand that the person at the centre is the one we should be thinking about. And if we all do that, then we're going to move forward much better and quicker and more effectively.
Absolutely. I think it's changing the conversation a little bit. So we're not talking about voids. We're talking about vacant rooms in people's homes. We're talking about people. We're using people's names when we're talking about them if it's appropriate. This is a home for somebody. This isn't a unit or, and actually changing that conversation. So actually we're keeping it focused on that individual and what they need. And I think sometimes when developers are looking at, I've developed this 15 block unit somewhere and it's perfect for supported living. Actually, is it where John wants to live? Does John want to live with 14 other people in separate flats, or does he actually want to live in a bungalow in a street near his mum? What's right for those individuals? And I think keeping that focused is really, really important. And I think bringing it back to that. And that's what a lot of good providers do as well. Good providers are really good at keeping that focus on the individual. But sometimes when you're getting to scale developments, it becomes trickier to keep it focused on that. And that's something that as parents, again, and I know, that you guys do this all the time, but in meetings and stuff, is bringing it back to your individual, young person, saying, actually, this is what's right. This is what matters. But within that, as parents, I think it's important to also understand that there are difficult conversations that have to be had around things like leases and lease lengths, because as parents, you probably would be really happy for a 20-year lease to be signed for your young person. If the property feels right, you want them in that property, and that gives you that security of tenure. But actually, you might find that won't work because the mortgage company would never lend on a 20-year lease, or you might find there's other barriers that the provider can't commit to 20 years because they've only got a 5-year contract with the local authority. And it's understanding that actually there's all these different parts that have to come together to create a supported living home, and everyone has to kind of negotiate a little bit and give a little bit to be able to create that. And that takes skill and understanding, and is frustrating. I know I've been in meetings with parents where it's very frustrating because actually what they want is this really high, absolutely perfect gold standard. And actually there just isn't the funds to do that. So therefore, how do we compromise in the best way to meet that individual's needs, but also make it still work for everyone else involved? It is frustrating sometimes.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your time.
It's been great chatting to you. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks for listening. For many people who need supported living, finding the right place to live is always going to be a challenge. So anything that will help has got to be a good thing. So I really applaud Lisa's campaign to get people talking, because that's the only way we will break down the misconceptions that are held on all sides. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please share it with others and spread the word that there are solutions out there and we can learn from each other by sharing those. Of course, if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch, Deborah@expandingworlds.com, or you can message me online. You find me on Instagram @Deborah Caldo.